Θα ήθελα τώρα καταρχήν να καλωσορίσω τον επίσημο προσκεκλημένο μας και θα έλεγα ότι είναι και το κεντρικό πρόσωπο στο βαθμό που ως εκπρόσωπος της ιταλικής εμπειρίας θα μας μεταφέρει την συνολική εικόνα της λειτουργίας της υποχρεωτικής διαμεσολάβησης στην Ιταλία. Πράγμα το οποίο για πολλούς από εσάς και τέλος πάντων τον κόσμο της διαμεσολάβησης αποτελεί ένα ορόσημο και το αναφέρουμε πολλές φορές ως πετυχημένο παράδειγμα, ως best practice, το οποίο ζητάμε και από την πολιτεία να αναλάβει πρωτοβουλία προς αυτή την κατεύθυνση. Καλωσορίζω λοιπόν τον κύριο Leonardo Urso, το οποίος είναι ο CEO του ADR Center Member of JAMS International, και τον παρακαλώ να πάρει το λόγο, ζητώντας του να μας παρουσιάσει την Ιταλική πραγματικότητα και λέγοντάς του μάλιστα για ένα σημερινό παράδειγμα, όταν σε μια υπόθεση που απασχολεί το γραφείο μου στην Ιταλία, μας έστειλαν μήνυμα ο Ιταλός συνάδελφος ότι ο δικαστής που δίκαζε την υπόθεση που μας απασχολεί καλεί τα μέρη σε conciliation και πρέπει οπωσδήποτε να λάβουμε μέρος σε αυτό το conciliation με θετική θέση και τελώς θα ληφθεί υπόψη. Άρα δεν είναι μόνο η διαμεσολάβηση προφανώς, ένα best practice για την Ιταλία, αλλά και παράλληλοι θεσμοί που βοηθούν, που γενικά προάγουν τη γενική αντίληψη των εναλλακτικών μορφών επίλυσης διαφορών. Κύριε Ντούρσο, είμαστε όλοι αυτιά, είμαστε στη διάθεσή σας.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the Op.E.M.E.D. As always, and the Chamber of Commerce. It's always a pleasure to be in Athens, and actually an honor to contribute to the discussion on the future of mediation in Greece by sharing my personal experience, my last 20 years, day by day experience in mediation, and experience of Italy in the last also 10 years. Italy has been a great laboratory on mediations. We change different legislations, and by trial and errors, I guess we found the right balance, the right recipe. And looking ahead, looking at the way how to shape the mediation in the futures, my approach actually is looking back. So that's why I highlighted the words 20 years of analysis. As you, most of you knows, the ADR movement started in United States, in California, about mid of 70s, 40 years ago. And in mid of 90s, this movement was kind of imported in Europe. So in Europe, we have 20 years of experience of best practice, of few best practice, and a lot of failures, a lot of worse practice, I should say. So I don't think so. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this conference, the working groups were based on opinions, on great ideas, on what we call wishful thinking. Now, the debate on the future of mediation is not about opinion, it's not about my opinion, how I think about mediation. It's about numbers, statistics. And let's look at the past, what has happened in Europe. So one of the breakthrough actually in Europe after these 20 years, I mean mid of 90s, end of 90s, when we imported this movement on ADR, you know that in 2008, the European Union started with the directives on mediations. And actually the goal, the objectives of these directives was to achieve a right balance between the numbers of mediations and the numbers of judicial proceedings. And by achieving this, the European Union gave some tools. ensuring the quality of mediations. One idea was if we have a high quality of mediations, we will attract mediators, we attract mediations. So we have two accredited mediators. We're trying to keep the service, the level of service very high. To promote referral mediation. The judge should refer to cases, pending cases to mediations. Enforceability of the agreements was important in the directives, and keeping the confidentiality of mediation. And after 10 years, actually, from 2008, basically 9 years, the European Parliament asked the jury committee, actually, of the European Parliament, asked me and my colleague Giuseppe De Palo to write a report. And the report was, the aim of the report was actually, did the directive achieve this balanced relationship between mediation and judicial proceedings in all member states? Please, check the numbers, go outside and gather the numbers. Okay, so we did. We gathered numbers, statistics from all member states. And actually our first idea was, well, first we have to measure this balanced relationship. Okay, how we measure? And we came up with the two index. And this was in this actual report. You can download for free from the European Union website. And our proposal is to understand if this balanced relationship was achieved. You have to look at two numbers. The first two index. The first index is a ratio, is the number of mediations divided by the number of cases in courts. Okay, you keep the easy formula. You keep the numbers of mediations every year, and divided by the number of cases in court, of course, civil cases in court each year, and you got a percentage. The second index that you should look at to is the success rate. Of course, it doesn't make sense to have huge numbers of mediations with little success rate, 1%, 10%. So we come up with this matrix, and where there are the combination of the two index. And of course, the goal is being in the second quadrant of this matrix, where a jurisdiction with many mediation with high success rate. So basically, we run these numbers and this index, and I give you one exercise in math. Let's calculate together the balanced relationship matrix in Greece. How many mediations have been last year here? Couple hundreds, 200s, 300s, let's say 500, more or less? Let's say 200s, okay. Let's divide it, how many cases in courts you have last years? Millions? In Italy we have about 3.5 millions of new cases, of new incoming cases on civil cases each year. Okay, in a whole. So I guess, I don't know the numbers, but I think it's in the range of millions usually. Pardon? 1 pending cases, but incoming cases. We are talking about 300,000? Okay. Well, it's low, Anyway, in others, let's go. So basically, if you do this proportion, I think will be much less than 1%. Okay, so we run this exercise in all member states. In all member states, basically, we found that there was no balanced relationship at all. Actually, it was much less than 1%. So it means that each like 100 cases that incomes in court, just only one or maybe half goes to mediation. So we found, well, actually these directives didn't achieve the goal. It was a great milestone to start to talk about mediation, to have new domestic legislations. I'm working now also with the Minister of Justice in Serbia. Serbia, as you know, is in the process to join the European Union, And the European Union, one of the criteria is you have to fix your civil justice, your courts. So there is a big project sponsored by European Union to increase the efficiency of the civil justice, and they have a law. They had actually two different laws on mediations, and last year they had 30 mediations, 30 mediation, and they have about 1 million of new cases each year. So there is, it seems it has been actually a failure. Another project that I'm running with CEPEJ. CEPEJ is the department of to measure the efficiency of justice, civil justice at the Council of Europe. And just a few months ago, they set up a new working group on mediation. So this is a new great indicators that all European institutions, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and also other institutions are looking at mediation as one of the main tools, not the only tool, of course, but one of the main tools to increase the efficiency of justice. And also in this report that we will present in a couple of months, we are getting more or less the same numbers. Of course, the Council of Europe is done by 47 member states, so a lot, but more or less it's almost the same. The only exception, and I have to say it's weird, but is Italy. Italy, as I told you again, we tried, it's 20 years, that we tried different laws, and my involvement in mediation started in 1998. When I came back from the United States, I assisted to a lot of mediations, and so I opened an idea center. I thought, whoa, we will have a lot of mediations. There is a huge needs of mediations in Italy. Zero. So my first, from 1998 to almost 2010, so it was a failure. So I had an experience of 12 years of failures, of frustrations. We did a lot of trainings, a lot of projects, but not really mediations. In 2010, our government, the Minister of Justice, in implementing the directives, the 2008 directives, instead of most of the countries, member states, implementing lightly with the voluntary mediations, they introduced the first full mandatory mediations. Then this full mandatory mediation was declared in 2013 in constitutional by our constitutional courts, and because the lawyers challenged this law and they won actually. But then in 2013 we had a new law on mediation that I will explain. And this new law now is 4 years that we have, and it was just a few months ago, it was started as a pilot project, a pilot law with the sunset. It was supposed to be September the 20 of 2017, and just a few months ago, the government passed the law to have this law permanent. So it's permanent for life, okay, in Italy. And the goal of, we had, two goals. The first goal is decrease the incoming civil cases. So as I told you, in Italy there are about 3.5 million of new civil cases per year. And another goal was, of course, decrease the pending civil cases. We have about 4 million of civil cases per year, okay? With two different goals. The new law introduced 3 ways to start mediations. The first way is the opt-out model, or mandatory first mediation meetings. Basically, ours that in 10% of civil cases, not all 100% of civil cases, only 10%, was a pilot by the time, and it was a pilot by the dispute matters. And like inheritance, medical malpractice, banking and insurance contracts, real estate, division of assets, defamations, and few others. In only these dispute matters, before going to court, the party had to, not going like the previous law, go to full mandatory mediation, but they have to sit down with the first meetings, with the professional mediators, for a small fee of 40 euro. Then, if the other party do not show up, the judge can sanction the party absent. So basically, if in the first meetings there are only one party, we issue a certificate saying who was present, and usually is the plaintiff. And with these certificates, the plaintiff can go to the court and can start, a judicial proceedings. And the judge must sanction the party absent. If both parties, they show up with the first meetings and they talk about the opportunity to go to voluntary to full mediations, and if one party, they say, okay, I showed up, I met the other guy, but I don't think there is any room for settlement, and basically I don't want to spend money for the full mediation fees, I can opt out without sanctions. So I fulfill my obligations to be present at these first meetings. And of course, both parties agree to go ahead. They decide the fees of mediations for the mediators, and they have like 3 months with different sections to find an agreement. Now, 50% of the time, the party decide to go ahead with full mediations, just because they meet each other. A lot of times they don't meet each other. So this was actually a pilot in 10% of the dispute matters. In the other 90% of the dispute matters, there are still voluntary mediations, is opt-in, what we call opt-in. So the parties have to sign voluntarily an agreement to start mediations. It's more or less similar to your law. And this is in the remaining 90% of the cases. And then and of course, this opt-in model can work also for incoming cases and also for pending cases. I mean, even if you have a pending cases, you can voluntarily both parties go to mediations. And then we have a third, intake, a third way to start mediation is more than mediation, is referral, mediation referral, is ordered by judge. So basically the judge can say it's up to his or her discretions, looking at the case, looking at the behavior of the parties, can order the party to go to attempt mediation. And usually, because the two hearings, between the duration, the time lapse between hearings are in Italy, depends on the court, of course, like 4 or 6 months. So basically, what the order, the judge say, okay, before the next hearing, the next sittings, there will be like in 6 months, you go to mediation, so there are no impact on the duration of the judicial proceedings if during the hearings you attempt mediation. So if in the next hearings you come back, the lawyers come back and say, okay, we found a settlement, thank you, they close the case. Otherwise, we go ahead with the judicial proceedings. So, guess what is the numbers of mediations, where they come from? After 4 years, from the opt-out model, 10% of the civil cases. From the voluntary mediations, that means promotions, voluntary, with wishing of the parties, or referral by judge. What do you think? Well, after 4 years, here there are the 80% of the cases of mediation that comes from the opt-in or for mandatory mediation, the mandatory first meetings. So on the 10% of the civil cases generates the 80% of mediations. The voluntary cases, actually there are 90%, are still 10%, actually less than 10%. Other more or less 10% comes from a referral. So this is the proof. I was talking about, look at the evidence, look at statistics, looks at numbers, that in the same country, means with the same lawyers, with same companies, with the same culture, we have completely different results in mandatory mediation, and actually it's a mitigated mandatory mediation, voluntary mediations, or referral by judge. So this is proof that mediation do not come, unfortunately, from the culture. You cannot change the culture. There is, I can talk about hours about barriers to mediations, to voluntary mediation. There are a lot of reasons because the parties, they do not voluntarily agree to settle. Okay, a lot of reasons. But let's go ahead. So with these truth models, in the dispute matters where there is this mandatory first meetings, actually we have now more mediations than cases in court. Okay, we have the index is 114%. In the voluntary mediation, in the 90% of the dispute matters where it's still voluntary mediation, we are like the same of all other countries. We're less than 1%. So this again is a proof, is statistics that prove that voluntary mediation, unfortunately, they do not generate enough results. And in having some goals, some results, you have to think about how many really numbers, how many mediation you want to generate. And again, this is basically the core of the mandatory first meetings. Well, the party filing a mediation request. These first meetings must be held within 30 days, so there is no big delays of the starting of court proceedings. And depends, as I told you, depends if the counterpart is absent or not, which will be the outcome. And I've in our office, we have different offices in Italy now. Every day we assist into this magic of the first meetings, where you have in front of you as a mediator all parties, all decision makers, usually the two lawyers, the two parties. There are a lot of times they are not happy to be in the same room, and because it's mandatory, so it's mandatory they have to be in the same room. But then when you start the information sessions, or I start a little bit to mediate, and they understand the value of mediations. So this is really promotion, to have the parties there, because they have to comply with the obligation. And then I told you 50% of the times they agree to voluntarily go ahead with the full mediation. This is another statistics, another proofs. Let's see. So this is the numbers of incoming cases in first instance tribunal in court in Italy on three dispute matters. One is properties or the real estate. And you see from 2011 we had 29,000 of new cases under these properties, real estates, and then they increase. Then the other sector is renting apartments, houses, and so on. And the third one is intellectual service contracts, disputes about lawyers' contracts or intellectual services. The first two are under the mediation, mandatory first meeting. You see that they increased from 2011, 2012, and then they start to decrease, and in the last year they decreased by about 30% incoming cases. While the last one, intellectual service contract disputes, is not under the mandatory mediations provisions, is still on voluntary, and they increase. So this is again a different effect of mandatory and voluntary mediation in the same country, with the same lawyers, with the same judges and parties. And this is on the top is the number of new cases in court, and on the bottom the number of new mediations in Italy. And you see, for example, I want to see. Point from the 2011, 2012, when the mediation start to increase and the case in court start to decrease. And they increased the mediation numbers, increased because of the first full mediation law. And when the constitutional courts declare that law inconstitutional, you see in 2013 they decreased from one day to another. It's like a switch on and switch off. And in 2014, with the new law, they start to increase the mediation and decrease the incoming cases in court. So again, these are numbers. It's not my opinions. This is some numbers. So in our debates, there have been a lot of debates, a lot of conferences that these mediations, full mediation, the first meetings could be a barrier to access to justice. In our constitutional charter, like in all member states, is the rights for the parties to go to courts. And as the professor already mentioned, so we had a case, 2010 Alassini cases. The Court of Justice declared that the mediation, mandatory mediation, in line with the constitutional courts and the rights to access to justice. And actually, it was about a previous law on mandatory mediation in small cases of telecommunication. But we had a very important new judgment just June this year, 14 June 2017. The EU Court of Justice had a new case, and the judgment about this law in Italy. And the judge say that, talking about our new law that described not precluding national legislation which prescribes recourse to mediation procedures as a condition for the admissibility of legal proceedings. Again, so there is no problem of the access to justice. Actually, is the other way around. Mediation enlarge the access to justice because you give more people the rights to solve their disputes. People that do not want to have money to hire a lawyer or they don't have the knowledge to go to the court. So it's enlarged. And at the same time, they preserve the resources, the scarce resources of judges and court staffs for all the disputes that must be decided by a judge. I'll give you an analogy. In our constitutional courts, there is the rights for health, to be in good health, and for this reason, our government they give the public service in hospital. But what if the hospitals would be open for everyone for an headache or something minor injuries? And of course, the people that really need to go to the hospital to be hospitalized, they will not have any seats there. They don't have any bed. So for this reason, of course, in the hospital, you are admitted only if you have a serious illness. Okay, if you have a headache, I mean, you have to try to cure your headache at home or with other resources. So more or less is the same principle. The court should, be devoted by only the disputes that, the judge should decide. This is another big news. Just September, less than 1 month ago, 12 September 2017, there was a resolution of the EU Parliament where the main conclusion was stressed that all member states make provision for the possibility for courts to invite the parties to use mediation or at least to attend information sessions on mediation. So basically, actually in this resolution, the only member states quoted in this resolution was the best practice of Italy. So, and I'm finished with this slide. What is the lesson learned in the past 20 years in Europe and in Italy? First, the first index, the ratio between mediations and number of cases in court, the statistics demonstrates that the required initial mediation session is the only effective and proven model that can generate and achieve a balanced relationship in about 2-3 years. In 3 years, 2-3 years, doesn't take such generations, and comply with the right of access to justice. I always, in this conference, I give you a challenge. If to my colleagues that writes about voluntary mediation, writes other way to generate enough mediation in a kind of short time, like 3 years, 4 years. I will host whoever in a nice week for a nice weekend in Rome, 5-star hotels, everything's paid, okay? Nice restaurant, everything paid. Whoever can demonstrate that with a different model, with the voluntary mediation in whatever jurisdictions, you can generate, there's a jurisdiction that generates many mediations like this model in 3-5 years. It's impossible. There is no other member states or jurisdictions that have, with a voluntary mediation, poor voluntary mediation, have generates these numbers of mediation. Even United States, I know very well United States is all another judicials and is very different step by steps, but at the beginning was also a mandatory presence or start. The second index, don't forget the second index, so the success rate. Actually, in Italy, there is a huge difference. The statistics say that there is about a range of plus or minus 25% of success rates between mediation providers. You think about that too. In Italy, we have about 650 mediation providers, mediation centers, accredited by the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice has an office that only job is accredited providers, mediation centers, and mediators. Okay. And actually, there is a difference. I mean, the success rate is about an average 55-60%, but there are some providers, some centers have an average of 75-80%, and others that have average 40%. So the big difference here is the quality of the mediators, is the quality of the centers, the high standards of trainings. And so the question, just to go to the conclusion, is not my opinion. Is a statistics, is 20 years of experience of evidence in Europe say that the question is not if introduce a mandatory mediation, but how. And mandatory mediation can have different aspects, different shadows. It's not black and white. I give you an example, 2 examples. In Italy, we had, back a few years ago, a mandatory mediation on labor disputes. Actually, before 2010, and the and it was a failure, and that's why a lot of lawyers, when we start to talk about mandatory mediation, they refer to the mandatory mediation in labor and say it didn't work in the labor dispute. Why it should work in commercial and civil disputes? Well, if you look at really at our law on mandatory mediation in labor dispute, the fact was that the mediator was not a professional mediator, was an employee of the labor office. Well, his job was basically, before going to the court, asking to the parties, to the employer and to the employee, do you want to mediate? Do you want to mediate? No, okay, what's the next one? So this is not mediation, but it was mandatory mediation. So depends what we are talking about mandatory mediation. Another example, a good example of the failure of mandatory mediation is Romania. In Romania, a few years ago, they had a very similar law like Italy. So there was a mandatory mediation of the first meetings. So they start to train a lot of people. There was a lot of trainings, a lot of setting up centers. Then when this mandatory mediation starts to be implemented, what has happened that only the plaintiff show up in the first meetings, and the defendant who was calling to mediation never show up. So 95% was a failure, because its first meetings was a failure, it was only the defendant side. Well, they forgot just one provision. They forgot to sanctions the party that didn't show up to the first meeting. So actually the mandatory part was only for the plaintiff, not for the defendant. And so that's why in I think 2013, the Constitutional Court of Romania declared inconstitutional that first meetings because it was a waste of time and waste of money. And that's why in mandatory mediation, you have to decide, and depends on your experience, how. So the level of mandatoriness, I know that this word doesn't exist in English, but it depends, okay? Was it full mandatory or is it mandatory only the first meetings? In which kind of disputes? There is a debate, we had a debate on which kind of dispute they should start, by the value, by the relationship. For example, in Italy works very well what we call condominium, the neighbors. So people that lives in the same buildings, they have the dispute how to share the expenses, the common expenses, the parking lots. We have a lot of this dispute and works fine. Why? Because there is a relationship, a future relationship between the disputants. So the works inheritance cases, disputes between brothers and sisters, how to divide the will of the parents, because the parties they will have to live together in the future, and because there is not only the solution based on the civil code, but there's also psychologists between the brothers and the sister and so on. So in which progression do you want that mandatory mediation enter? You cannot do from one day to another. I mean, it takes a roadmap, like maybe 3 years, 5 years. You start with a certain dispute matters. Then it's like our law say, okay, then the government should have write a report, what's happened, and decide what's the other next, dispute matters. And in looking back to the dispute matters, we had good reports, good studies on the numbers. So, for example, car accident. Car accident, there are millions of cases in car accidents. Inheritance, there are only 10,000. So you have to basically decide the disputes under the mediation, mandatory mediations will provide based on the numbers. Okay, and another sanction, incentives. Which fees will be free mandatory mediation or market price, and who should administer the mediation, mediators, level of quality, and so on. So basically, I give you some good arguments to think about, and I think that our experience, we made a lot of mistakes, so you can gain from our mistakes, our errors, and don't spend 20 years to achieve the goal that we have achieved after 20 years of trial and error and mistakes. Thank you very much.